Welcome to the next video in the Suggestion App course. This is a complete course where we'll build a .NET 6 Blazor server application with MongoDB from the ground up. There are three things you need to know before we get started. First, this is part of a series, and this isn't the first video in the series. If you're just starting out, you should check out the playlist that's linked in the description to start from the first video in the series. Second, this course is actually a paid course. MongoDB sponsored it so you can put the videos on YouTube for free. Check out the link in the description to sign up for MongoDB Atlas for free to thank them if you haven't already. Third, you can also buy this course on IamTimCorey.com. The link is in the description. Buying this course will get you all the lessons right away, the source code for each lesson, a certificate of completion, offline access, and more. It also helps sponsor more free content. The video will be the same as it is on YouTube, so feel free to watch the free version if you want to. Okay, let's jump into today's video. Note there may be more than one lesson in this video, since some lessons are short. Now let's create the Create page. So we'll add a new Razor component. We'll call this Create. And let's close all but this. Let's get rid of our H3. And we're going to call this page Create. That's going to be a path for it. Now, this page will be a bit of a compromise in how we set things up because of the fact that you cannot go to the Create page until you're logged in. We don't want to allow people to create suggestions unless they are logged in. So this page will be restricted to only users who are logged in. And we don't have the login system up and running yet. Not a problem. We'll just kind of fake it until we make it. So we're going to create this page and we'll see how it works, but we're going to use our test user as the logged in user. So let's inject. We need the I category data. We need to inject the I suggestion data, if I spell it right. And we also need to inject the navigation manager called nav manager. So those are the big things we need to inject into our code. Let's go down to our code itself and say private. And we need to have a separate model for this. So what we need to have is a create suggestion model because we have to have some limitations on what you can create. So let's go to our models right here. If you need to use this model here, let's go to models, right click and say add class. Now we're going to have a model that creates a suggestion, but it's going to be limited in what it has in it. It's not going to have a ton of stuff. It's just going to have a few different properties. We could try to reuse the model in the class library, but that isn't going to have some of the UI specific things we need. So let's call this Create Suggestion Model. And we'll make this a public class, already is, great. We're going to have a prop, and this is going to be a string suggestion. We're going to have a prop string category ID and prop string description. So these are the three things we're going to capture from our form on the Create Suggestion page. So we're going to create a model just for this form. There's another reason for creating this model. We'll talk about it in just a minute. But I want to add some requirements here. So for example, it's required. Now I have the control dot here to add the data annotations using statement. That's this right here. We do not need to add this to the global using. So it's required, but I also want to say that the max length is not 100, Let's go with 75. That's the maximum length that fits well. We're going to have something similar for these two as well. Let's say that this one down here is not required, but we do have a max length of 500. So the description has to be 500 characters or less. The suggestion can be 75 characters or less. This category ID, this is the identifier, not the name, but we need to say that the category is required. Therefore, we can't just have an empty string here. We have to at least have a max length, or I'm sorry, a min length of 1. So a min length of 1 is required. If we said just required, then a empty string would suffice, and that's not okay. We have a string that at least has 1 character long. It would be longer than that, but that's at least the amount. Now, I also want to give us a display name. So display, the name is category. So it says category ID, but whenever we have an error where we say, hey, this field is required, it'll say category ID, and that's not going to be what we want to show the user. We want to show the user that error that says, hey, the category is required. So that will make it a little bit neater than just using the property name. For this one, the suggestion, and this one, the description, those are fine. That's a fine name to show to the user. So this creates now our create suggestion model. Let's go back over here and say private create suggestion model and control dot to add our using here for our models. And we'll call it suggestion equals new. We want to instantiate this right away. Now, we also want to have a private list of category model or categories. We want to show off or show a list of all our categories, select one. So you can say, I want to put it in this category. And then we'll have a private string. Actually, I don't think we need a private string category ID because we have that inside the create suggestions. So now we can do our protected override on initialized async. And again, it ate that last curly brace at the end just to put it back in. And we'll mark this as async. And now we're going to say categories equals await category data dot get all categories. And then we're going to have a logged in user. We're going to grab their who's logged in. So we could do that. I know that we're eventually going to talk to the user data. Let's just do it now. Inject user data called user data. And then we'll have down in here, we're going to have a logged in user. So private user model logged in user. And normally what we'll do is we'll do a lookup based upon who's logged in. But we don't know who's logged in yet because we don't have anybody logged in. So what we'll do is we'll kind of spoof this by saying logged in user equals await user data dot, and this is, was it get user? Yes, get user from authentication. And I believe it's ABC123. Let's go look at that in our database here. So you can go to users and it is ABC-123. That's our object identifier. So this is a shortcut or a hack until we have authentication. We'll replace this. In fact, what I'm going to do is I'm going to put a to do here. Replace the user lookup, because that's what we need to do is replace this with an actual user ID. And actually what we'll do is we'll just replace just this text with the ID coming from the authentication system. And the rest of the code will stay the same. So it's just this string right here gets replaced with the object identifier from Azure Active Directory B2C. So with that, we've now initialized this page. We can create a new method called private void close page. And if you remember the code from this, from the other page, same thing. Nav manager dot navigate to, just that /, and that's all we do. And then we'll have the more substantial method, and that is the private async task create. And we should say create suggestion because the page is called create, therefore we can't have create as a method as well. So suggestion model s equals new, s.suggestion equals our suggestion.suggestion. So what we're doing here is we're translating now. So you have this create suggestion model. That's what we're going to actually use a form to fill in. And now you need to translate that to a suggestion model. So s.suggestion. And now you may ask the question, why don't you do the same thing we do with our basic user and our basic suggestion, where we pass in the constructor the create user model and it transforms it into a suggestion model? Well, the reason why is because the create suggestion model is in our user interface. We do not want our class library to depend on the user interface. Therefore, it cannot know about that model. And you can say, well, then let's move our model into the class library. And no, I don't want to do that either because the model has UI-specific code in it. It has code about the requirements and the length and how we're going to display it. This is all UI-specific stuff. So I don't want to put that into my class library. Therefore, we can just do a manual mapping right here. It's not a big deal. s.description equals suggestion.description. s.author equals new basic user model, passing in the logged in user. s.category equals categories where c.category ID. Got too many windows open here. Oops, ID. There we go. c.id equals suggestion.category ID. First or default. So it's going to find the category that matches the one you selected. Now, I say first and default here. Really, we could say first. It wouldn't matter because you cannot get to this point without giving a valid category ID selection. And we're only going to allow you to choose from a list that we generate for you. So therefore, it's kind of locked in on Rails, but first default is fine. In theory, you could get one that has a category of null, not a category. I don't see how you could do that, but in theory, that might happen. And if that's the worst case, not a huge deal. So what we're going to do is do a lookup based upon the category ID that's been selected. Now, why are we doing it this way instead of just having this be the category? Not a string, but the actual category model. Well, that's because of how we're doing the selection for this. It'll be a radio option. And radio values are just strings. And so we can't have a whole model there. But we're going to map it like this. So now we have this mapped out. We can say if let's do this. Let's actually check this category. If s.category is null, then what we'll do is we'll say category ID is empty, and it's actually not category ID, it is, it's suggestion dot category ID equals empty string, and then return. So we're going to wipe out that category ID and start over again if it is null, if we didn't find that entry. So we'll do a check there just to be sure, but we shouldn't ever get to this point. Now we've got our created suggestion. We can say await suggestion data dot create suggestion, pass in our suggestion, and then we can say suggestion, which is our create suggestion model. Yes, I know it's a little confusing, equals new. So we'll reinstantiate that, and then we can close the page. Now, technically, we don't have to reinstantiate our suggestion because of the fact we're closing the page, and that will wipe everything out. But I like to be thorough and make sure that, for whatever reason, if this didn't work or whatever, it would still wipe out our suggestion. That way we don't double create one. So with that, this is all the creation logic there is. So let's talk through the actual page itself, because this is where it gets a little bit more tricky. In fact, this is where I actually went and had to talk to the developers at Microsoft to say, hey, I'm getting some weird issues. Can you help me out? And they did. And I was able to get some help both from them and from the community, and we got things straightened out. There are some quirks that we're going to see based upon the style and the way I am doing things. So let's see this and see how it lays out. So first we'll get our H1 out of the way, make a suggestion. Now note, I'm just doing regular casing here, but using CSS, we can make this all uppercase, all lowercase. We can capitalize each word. It's really up to our styling how we do that. So therefore, I'm not going to worry about it. And in fact, these will be all uppercase, I believe. Div. Then we'll have another div. And then we'll have inside here a div that has a button in it. On click equals close page. And that'll be the button there. The reason we're not putting a value or text in between the opening and closing the button is because we're actually going to use a class that's going to put an X in that button. A nice little, it's a icon. That's the word I'm looking for. Now, after the close page button, we're going to have an if statement. If categories is not null, which they shouldn't be, but we'll make sure we check this, because what will happen is when the page first loads, there we go. When the page first loads, categories will be null. Therefore, we don't want to have this section show. Now, again, I'm going to put the code outside of it and move it into this if statement. Edit form. Now, I like to close out the edit form first and then come back to put the things in it, like model, which is suggestion. And on valid submit equals create suggestion. So that's our edit form. Now note it says on valid submit. If it's not a valid submit, it will not submit the form. So if you hit the button and you have not filled out all the fields properly, it will not submit the form. It will only submit the form if you fill out all 3 sections correctly. Now, because we have that, I also want to have DataAnnotationsValidator and the ValidationsSummery. And what this is this will make sure that I'm validating my form. So the model here has some validation logic in it. This creates suggestions. So it says this is required, this is required, this is not required, but it does have a max length. this has a min length, this has a max length. And so these are validation requirements. We're just going to check to make sure that all three of these match their validation requirements. If they don't, we're going to put all those messages at the top in a validation summary message. If we wanted to, we could put a validation message underneath every field if we wanted to have specific validation messages for each one. But I'm just going to put it all at the top and call it good. Next up, we're going to have a div. Nope, not dialog. Let's start over. Div, there we go. And this will be have a label. And the label is going to be for the suggestion text. And let's not have a class. We'll wait on that one. And we'll say suggestion. And then we're going to have a div that has some information about it. So I'm just going to copy and paste it. There's no reason for you to watch me type it all out. But this is the message for our suggestion. Focus on the topic or technology you want to learn about. And then we'll have our input text. Now, if you're not familiar with Blazor forms, this edit form is part of a Blazor form. So is this input text. These are wrappers around the standard HTML forms. It's just extra stuff added on top. So when we actually render this page, it'll be a form object here, and this will be an input object with type of text. So just note that that's what's going on here. All right, so I'm going to say that the ID here equals suggestion text, which matches up to the 4. This allows screen readers to understand that this label is associated with this input. As long as you spell this stuff right. Just be careful of that. And they're going to say at bind value equals suggestion dot suggestion. And then we're going to close this out. Self-closing tag. And that's our first input. So we're just going to have an input, which is a text file or text input that says, hey, go ahead and give me your suggestion. And we're going to have this bind to our suggestion in our model. Pretty straightforward. This next one, I'm tempted to skip and come back to. Let's skip it and come back to it because we have another one that looks very, very similar. So I'm going to copy this. I'm going to leave a space in between, but I'll paste it. And instead of suggestion text, the label is for description. And the ID is description, but this is a input text area. And let's grab the description for that. And this is also description. And again, description on the bind value. So an input text area is a text area box. It's a bigger box than a standard input text. It has multiple lines. And since we have 500 characters, we need multiple lines instead of one long line. So that is our descriptions. We have now our suggestion and our description. Let's have one more div down here with a button inside of it. And the type equals submit. And we'll say suggest as the text inside that button. So that's our form so far. We have suggestion and description. Cool, no problem. Pretty standard stuff here. But we have one more thing to do, and this is where the tricky bit comes in. And that is that we want to have a radio input. If you're not familiar with radio input, what a radio input is those little round circles where you can only choose one. So I don't want to have those little round circles. I just want to have a label you can click on. And whatever label you click on, that's the category you're selecting. So it's going to be a control that we create that's a little bit more stylized. Now, when I created this form, I created that radio input using the normal radio group, which you can do. It's called input radio group, like this. The problem was that if I filled in text in this input right here, so on the form, I start typing something, and then I go to click on a radio option, it would not register my first click. I had to click a second time. And I could recreate it every single time. It was frustrating. I couldn't figure out why that was. It turns out it's how this form gets created so that it re-renders the form whenever there's a change. But there's some behind-the-scenes stuff going on where if you don't have something directly in your model, then it doesn't render properly. So if it's not in your model, it tries to re-render every single time anything happens. What I had done initially was instead of binding it to something in the suggestion model, I bound it to a separate text, and then I did this mapping here to map it to the correct category. But then I put it into the model. And so I have a suggestion or a category ID in the model, but it still was doing that same thing. It turns out I have to create a component that makes this a little easier. So if you're not familiar with components, these right here are components. The cool thing is we can just override the existing component and add to it. So let's do that. We're going to create a custom component for this radio input group or input radio group. So let's right click on components. That's why I have this folder here. We're going to say add, and we're going to add a new class file. And we're going to call this, let's call this my input radio group. Now we need to bring in a namespace. So using Microsoft.ASP.NET Core.Components.Forms. That'll be necessary in just a minute. And we need to say that the public class takes in a T value, and this inherits from input radio group, which also takes in a T value. Now we're going to say private string underscore name and private string underscore field class. And then we can come down here and say protected override. And this is the on parameter set, like so. And in here, we'll cut this out. We'll bring it back in just a minute. We're going to say var field class equals edit context question mark dot field CSS class field identifier or string.empty. So that's a null coalescing operator. So what it's going to do is going to say, hey, get the field identifier or put an empty string here if you don't have a field identifier. And then if field class is not equal to underscore field class or name is not equal to name, then field class equals field class, name equals name, and there is our base on parameter set. So this is going to only execute this if we have a change in field class or name. So that's going to limit how often this gets triggered. Yes, that may be a little complex. The basics here are just, it's a new component you can use. So if you don't want to dive too deeply into how a sausage is made because you haven't dove that deeply into input text or EditForm probably, that's okay. You can just say, hey, it's a new component I can use that will not cause that double click to be necessary. That's essentially what it's going to do. It's going to monitor the input and only change the input if it's necessary, only redraw the input. So with that, we can now come back to our form here, and we can say div. We have a label. In fact, let's do a copy and paste from up here. It's very similar. And this was going to be for our category. We'll call this category. And I am going to say, I'll just type it out. Choose one category. But then we're going to have another div. And inside this div, we'll have my input radio group, which control dot to add a using statement for those components. That's going to add the using right up here. So my input radio group, that's the new one I just created. ID equals category. And bind value equals suggestion dot category ID. So now we have this. We can do a for each var c in categories. And then inside this for each, we'll loop through every category available to us. We'll create a div for them, and we'll have an input radio value equals at c dot category. Oops, not categories, ID. There we go. And then the ID equals the same thing, at c.id. And the reason we're going to give the ID the same, we're going to give the identifier of the input radio the identifier of the category, because we need to have a unique identifier for each ID that does it for us by making sure that every identifier matches the identifier of the category. So, but the value, that's what's important, is the ID of each category. So now afterwards, we're going to have a label for at c.category, ID. That's where we're going to match up our label to our input is based upon this ID, which is here, and the for matches the same ID. And then we'll say, close it out, at c.category name, category name, I'll put a dash, and then at c.category description. And that'll give us a nice name space dash space description. So we know what the categories are. So it's going to say 10-minute training, and it's going to describe what those are, or dev questions and describe what those are. So we're going to loop through every one of those for each category. And in the end, we'll see a list of categories to select from. So let's see this in action, but in order to do that, we have to manually go to the create page, just because we have not wired it up yet, because we have not set up our permissions yet, or our authentication authorization. So let's not put any more sample code in than we have to. We have this one line of sample code, that's okay, but the rest, we're not going to want to hard code anything else if we can avoid it. So we'll just go manually to the /create page. So once this loads up, we'll say /create, and there's our create page. Notice that I can type in here, let's hit suggest first. And now it puts a red outline around all my radio buttons, around the input, and it says the suggestion field is required and the category field is required. Notice it's category, not category ID. We have that rename of the display name. So we can put something in here like test. We tab out. Now it's green. It's no longer a message up here. We can choose one of these. So in-depth tutorial. Notice I clicked on the words, not in the little radio button. And then we can put something in our description if we want, or we don't have to. But we can say, this is a test. We hit suggest, and it goes back to this page. Notice there's still only 5 suggestions. However, if we come over to our database and look at our suggestions, we'll see there's 6 suggestions. And this last one down here, if we look, we'll see test. This is a test, but it says approved for release is false. If we change this to true, and we come down and say update, then that will refresh this list. Now we have 6. Now note that it did refresh because it's been more than a minute since it had last pulled the list, but if we did it again, it would probably still say 6 because of the fact that we have that caching in place for a minute. So now if we look, let's see, the latest one's up top. So test is up top, whereas if we go to popular, now test is probably near the bottom. 4, 3, oh, there test is, because it's the newest of the unvoted on suggestions. So now we can see our sorting does work. It's hard to see this because it's a little ugly. It's a lot ugly, but it does have all the data on the page. So that's now our create page. Our create page does work. We can fill it in. We can mess around with which one to choose. If we type something here and then select, it immediately, the click works. It's not a double click scenario. If we had just done the input radio group, there would require a double click sometimes. And what happens is it's actually a race condition that is occurring because of some asynchronous code that's running. So yes, it gets pretty detailed and in-depth, and I'm still pushing for it to be fixed as it's not a great solution we have right now, but we do have the option of making this work well. Okay, so that's the create page. We have that all set up. We can close out that error. And now we can move on to other pages and kind of wrap up really the rest of the pages, the kind of cleanup stuff, because we've done the major pages. The sample or the suggestion page is done, the create suggestion page is done, and the suggestion detail page is done. So we just need a few more smaller pages, and then we're really done all of the structure, the HTML side of our site. We can move on to authentication and then get into styling.